G'day, my name is Nick, and today I'm building just a cool little diorama based on two games that I used to play back in the day, Joel and Ellie from Last of Us and Plants vs Zombies. To get started on this build, I'll first mark out some sections on the plywood base. I'll then grab my hot foam wire cutter and begin to remove the section where I want the resin pool to go. For this diorama, I want the setting to be the backyard from the Plants vs Zombies games, with the house and the lawn and a little pool section like in the later levels. To get the foam attached to the plywood, I'll use some styrofoam safe glue and then weigh it down to get a strong bond. The first section of the diorama that I'll be working on will be the pool. You can't actually see under the water in the game, but I'm just going to assume it's a tiled pool. To make the tiles lining the inside of the pool, I'll grab some foam core board and remove the paper backing on each side. I'll then take a scalpel and carefully cut in the individual tiles in the foam core. Once the tiles are all cut in, I'll then come back in with a pen just to make the grooves between the tiles larger and more distinct. These grooves will also let me add some grout in between the tiles at a later stage. I'll then use my airbrush just to base coat all the tiles with a sky blue. To add a bit more visual interest to the tiles, I'll grab a few different shades of blue and then just randomly paint some individual tiles. The paint job here wasn't perfect, but the grout in the next stage will help hide a lot of the mistakes. To create the grout, I just used a bit of plaster of Paris and mixed that with some water and some PVA glue. After spreading the plaster across all the tiles, I can then come back in with a sponge and lightly remove the plaster from the raised sections. This will then leave the white grout in between each tile. Then, just using some hot glue, I'll attach the tile foam core panels into the pool section. I created some larger pool tiles to line the outside of the pool. I'll once again just use some hot glue and attach those around the edge. Then of course the zombies will need some way to exit the pool, so I 3D printed off some mini pool steps and painted them a metallic silver. I'll then just attach them to the final tile on the end of the pool using some super glue. I'll then cover the house section of the diorama using some foam panels that I cut out and painted a concrete grey. After those were glued and dried, I can then move on to the lawn section. First putting down a base coat of brown paint. This will just make sure that any sections which aren't completely covered with dirt or grass aren't the blue of the foam core underneath. After applying some glue, I can then lightly sprinkle some fine gravel and dirt across the whole section. To really seal down all the dirt, I'll carefully drop some watered down PVA and completely soak the dirt and gravel. Next, I'll grab my static grass applicator and fill it up with some 6mm grass. The static grass applicator is really good for getting some realistic looking grass on dioramas. It works by statically charging the grass fibres so they stand up straight when they land in the glue. Once again, seal all the grass and dirt with some watered down PVA. While I wait for that grass to dry on the diorama, I'm going to jump over and start work on the characters. The Joel and Ellie models are from Hell Creator over on Patreon, and I grabbed the Plants vs Zombies models from a few creators across the internet. After the models are printed off and prepped, I can then move on to base coating the models using my airbrush. Starting the base coating process, we'll just completely cover all the models in a black base coat and then come over the top with a white highlight to pick up all the details. Then starting with the zombies, I'll grab a couple shades of pale green and just cover all the skin on the zombies with the lighter green. Then coming back and picking up the shadows with a darker green. Once I've got all the skin base coated, I'll grab some silly putty and some masking tape and just use it to mask off the skin sections so I can start base coating the other sections of the model. I'll then continue to base coat the rest of the models. Now that the base coating is done, I'll grab my wet palette and start to paint in some of the more finer details in the zombies, like the eyes and their coats and their ties. Eyes are always super hard to paint, so I was kind of happy that these zombies just have little black dots for eyes instead of, proper pupils and irises that I'd have to paint in. To give a little bit more depth to the skin and just add a little bit more contrast to the zombies, I'll grab some oil washes that I've made with some oil paint that's been thinned down with some mineral spirits. These oil washes are really fluid and will flow down into all the cracks and crevices. This will just give a bit more definition to the eyes and the little holes that they have for noses. After the oil washes are dried, I can then come back in with a sponge and just remove the pigment from the raised areas. And with that, the zombies are pretty much done and I can move on to painting Joel and Ellie. Very similar process here, just base coating the skin and then coming back in with that silly putty to mask off different areas so I can base coat and shade them. I always find it really satisfying peeling off the silly putty and just seeing the progress that I'm making on the models. Then once again, just coming in with my paintbrush and picking up all the small details that are too small for me to airbrush. Not really that good at painting straight lines, to be honest, but I did my best on these striped lines on Joel's shirt. I'll then go over all the models with some dark green and black oil washes, just to add a bit of dirt and grime and weather their clothes a bit, since they're trudging through the apocalypse and they're not exactly going to be very clean. After removing the oil washes again, the painting of the models is pretty much done. Now that the characters are all painted, I can jump back onto the diorama and continue work on that. The first section I'm going to work back on the base is that little rickety fence that lines the backside of the yard. To make this fence, I'm just going to grab some little popsicle sticks and then chop them down to size using some pliers to create the picket fence shape. These little bits of wood were actually pretty hard to chop and would sometimes just go flying around my room. I'll then use some super glue and attach them to a larger popsicle stick in a sort of disorganized and random positioning, similar to how they are in the game. I'll then airbrush them with a bit of white and get a bit of weathering on them with some oil washes. I can then secure them into the foam using some toothpicks that I glued to the back of the fences. Next, I'll begin work on the house section. I printed off a door and a window with my 3D printer. I'll then base coat that just with a clean white. The 3D model had a few little brassy sections that came separate, so just had to glue them in place. Moving on to the window, I printed off some images of the inside of a house through the window. After cutting it out with a scalpel, I can then place it behind the window frame with a bit of plastic sheet in between to give it a bit of a sheen, like there's some glass in the window. The house in the game has a foundation that's made from bricks, so to create this in my diorama, I'm going to add some bricks to a piece of XPF foam in a similar process to how I created the tiles for the pool. Just cutting out the individual bricks using a scalpel and then coming back over with a pencil to widen all the gaps in between the bricks. After airbrushing the exterior wall of the house with a pale shade of yellow, I'll then base coat the bricks in a terracotta red and use a few different shades of maroons and reds to create some variation in the brick colours. To add some mortar in between the bricks, I'll once again use some plaster of Paris mixed with glue and water and spread that across all the bricks. Unfortunately, there was a mark on the foam that I'd made with a Sharpie from a previous project, I think, that just wouldn't be covered by the yellow base coat. But luckily the door, when I was glued down, covered most of that Sharpie mark. With the exterior wall now pretty much finished, I can glue that back onto the concrete foam base that we previously created. Up until this point, I actually thought I was going to make the diorama base more similar to the game map from Plants vs Zombies, but I kind of wanted to bring in some more of the apocalypse vibes from the Last of Us games. So I'm actually going to make the backyard more weathered and run down than it is in the Plants vs Zombies games. To add some weathering to the base, I added a whole bunch of grassy vines, fallen dead leaves, moss and dirt into areas where I thought that this decay and overgrowth would naturally accumulate. I then once again used some brown and green oil washes just to add some staining where mold and rain damage would naturally build up in the cracks and crevices of the diorama. Since the lawn is currently a bit too manicured for an apocalypse, I pulled out a few of my grass tufts just to add some weeds and overgrowth to the lawn. With the weathering all done, I can then move on to finishing the roof of the house. The tiles on the house from the Plants vs Zombies game are pretty ramshackle and disorganized, so I'm going to try and create something similar for my diorama. To create the tiles, I just grabbed an old cornflakes box and cut out a whole bunch of irregular shaped tiles. I can then hot glue these onto a bit of XPF foam. Once the tiles are all glued down, I can then paint them with a terracotta red. After a bit of weathering, I can then glue the roof section down onto the exterior wall we previously created. Now it's time to pour the resin for the pool. For some bloody reason, this bee decided to fly straight into my resin as I was preparing it. I carefully removed him from the resin and put him back outside, but when I went to check there in the morning, he wasn't there, so I don't know if he actually survived or not.
Dude, are you freaking kidding me?
In my previous diorama video, I added way too much pigment to the resin, so this time I really made sure to slowly add the ink and get the perfect light blue watercolor. Okay, so that was actually a lie. I completely ruined my first batch by adding way too much resin again. It's okay though, because I had an idea how to use that wasted resin for my next diorama, so hopefully you'll see that in my next video. To make it look like the snorkel zombie is actually swimming in the water, I'll use some glue tack and smoosh it onto his head and a couple of popsicle sticks. This will then let me float him in midair so the resin can cure around him, locking him in place. After 48 hours, the resin will be cured and I can pull off the acrylic sheets that I used to hold in the resin. Now it's time to get all the characters positioned on the diorama. I glued some metal rods into the feet of each character. This will just let me secure the models onto the diorama in a way that isn't permanent, so if I ever need to pack away and move the diorama, I can easily disassemble it without breaking the character models. And of course, it wouldn't be Plants vs Zombies without some plants, so I printed off and painted a sunflower and a pea shooter. And with that, the diorama is finished. Let me know down in the comments if you have any ideas for interesting matchups from different animes or TV shows or movies that I could battle against each other in my next diorama. Anyway, check out the reveal.